Hi, everybody. We're just going to take another minute to let people load in before we start. Okay, well, I think we're going to let people continue to load in, but I'm going to start. I want to be respectful of people's time. So I'm Maureen Frankel, the CEO and co-founder of the American Leadership Initiative. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this discussion of the global impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As many of you know, ALI has a mission of developing a 21st century vision for American global leadership based on American interests and shared values of inclusivity, sustainability, democracy, and human rights. We work closely with elected officials and the administration in developing our policies. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shaken the post-war era to the core. It has accelerated the drift away from international norms and institutions that were already framed by the policies of the Trump administration, the rise of China, and the global pandemic. We have with us today Ambassador Doug Lute, who is going to give us an update on the war and help us parse through its economic and national security implications. Ambassador Lute was appointed by President Obama to serve as the United States ambassador to NATO from 2013 to 2017. Prior to this position, he served 6 years under 2 presidents in the National Security Council, including as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor to coordinate the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before retiring from military service in 2010 as a lieutenant general, he served as director of operations on the Joint Chief of Staff, overseeing military operations worldwide, and the director of operations for the U.S. Central Command. Before retiring, Ambassador Lute will start our program by giving some opening remarks, after which I will ask several questions, and then we're going to open it to questions from the audience. Please put all your questions in the chat function or the Q&A function, and I will get to as many as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Ambassador Lute.
Well, thanks to ALI and to you, Ari, for that introduction, and it's good to be with you all today. I thought by way of framing our conversation today, and it is posed as a conversation, so I'll be brief. I would start by just reiterating and maybe expanding a bit on what's at stake in Ukraine and why should this be of concern to us? Why should it be of concern to ALI? But then also give you a brief update on where we are in the fight, and then finally where we might end up, or where we think this may be going. So first of all, by way of what's at stake, I think this very much speaks to ALI's mission, because this is bigger, this is more important, this is more impactful than simply the future of Ukraine itself. At stake here really is a competition between two frames, two contexts of how the world governs itself, how the world interacts. On the one hand, for over 300 years, we've been formed largely on the notion of sovereign nation states. This goes all the way back for the historians in the group to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Which established this concept of state sovereignty. So we were going to organize ourselves around states. And in the 20th century, that's been that principle of sovereign statehood has been embodied in the UN Charter and again as one way around which the world will organize itself. The competing model or the competing frame might be just considered empires, right? And of course, to a large extent, empires were the subject, were the big theme in the fight in World War I, the fight again in World War II, defeating the Japanese Empire, the German Empire. The post-Cold War or the post-World War II period featured wars over the defeat of colonial empires. And you might argue even the Cold War itself was a struggle of empires, right? Just one moment, please. Sorry about that. I thought I had everything on mute. I apologize. But what we have since the fall of the last great empire, the Soviet Union, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, and then the dissolution of the Soviet Empire itself in '91, has again been this reversion to state control. And what we've seen coming out of the empires in each instance, out of after World War I, after World War II, and after the Cold War, is this proliferation of states, mostly newly liberated states, like Ukraine as a prime example. And what we see, I think, with President Putin's invasion of about 100 days ago is an attempt to revert to the model of empire. He is trying, in essence, to reestablish vestiges of the Russian Empire. And not only the Russian Empire as embodied in the Soviet Union, but actually deeper than that in Russian empires as ruled by the Tsar. So this is his vision. And what's really in contest here are these two fundamental models of how the world operates. Do we operate as sovereign nation states with rights and territorial integrity, and the whole principle of sovereignties? Is that the set of rules of the road that we operate on? Or on the other hand, are large states able, by way of empire building, are they able to subsume smaller states, neighboring states, and rule them and dictate their outcomes? That's really, I think, the big frame of what's happening in Ukraine today. And I think with Putin's attempt to revert to empire, he has demonstrated that he's willing to violate every vestige of the other model. So all the way back to the UN Charter, to the Vienna Agreement of 1975, to the Budapest Agreement, which guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine itself in 1994, to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was an agreement between Russia and NATO as to how those two would interact, and then the Rome Declaration of 2002. So there's really a very fundamental contest underway here between nation states, the notion of nation states, sovereignty, and so forth, and the nation and the potential of reverting to empire. And really, I think when we think about Ukraine, we can sometimes get lost in the tactical detail, the ebb and flow of the battlefield. But I think this broader lens, this wider lens, is important to keep in mind. Well, how are we doing? As I mentioned, we're about 100 days into this. The invasion started at late February of this year, obviously. And initially, the Russian assault of over 150,000 Russian troops was rather poorly designed. I think it was designed around three assumptions that have proven faulty. First of all, the assumption was that the Russian military would dominate. They would be competent. They have not been. The assumption was the Ukrainians would be overwhelmed. They have not been. And the assumption was that the West would be divided. And we have not been. So Putin, in terms of his organizing assumptions for this fight, went 0 for 3. He was wrong on all three major assumptions. The initial phases of the attack featured a main effort to seize the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. And this was really prominent for about the first 45 days or so of the fight. And the Ukrainians won phase one. I mean, there's no contest here. The Russians did not control Kyiv. They did not topple the Zelensky government. And in fact, they withdrew from that front. In phase two, which is, I'd argue we're in phase two now, the Russians have narrowed their scope to the so-called Donbas region. This is the area immediately bordering Russia in the eastern limits of Ukraine. And it's an area which is heavily industrialized, features large, large urban populations. So there are many cities there, not just, this is not a area of just villages. There's significant urban population. There are a number of rivers that cut across the grain of a potential Russian advance. And this is the area where, going all the way back to the previous invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2014, actually when I was in the chair at NATO for the US, Putin tried to dominate this Russian-speaking neighboring two provinces of Ukraine. And so this is where he's focused now. The good news is, from a military sense, he has, from a Russian military sense, he has narrowed his front. He is less ambitious. His goals are more constrained, and he's very much now focused on this region, the so-called Donbas region. It is also good news for Russian military planners that this region immediately abuts Russia itself. So his supply lines, railroads, road networks, and so forth, are much simpler in resupplying this effort than in phase one. So he's got certain advantages. Now, on the Ukrainian side, I would argue that they have a dominant advantage, and that is that the quality of the Ukrainian armed forces and the citizenry who have been pressed into action in support of the Ukrainian army, the quality of those forces overmatches the quality of the Russian forces. And as a student of military history, I suppose, I just observed that it's a long-standing principle that quality typically beats quantity. In fact, Napoleon, this goes all the way back, 200 years ago, Napoleon made a statement along the lines that in war, the moral is to the physical. So quality is to quantity, as 3 is to 1. So he rated quality, which the Ukrainians certainly have, as 3 times more important than quantity. In phase one, that quality really proved out, and it was dominant in and around the fight for Kyiv. And here I'm talking about the morale of the forces, leadership, unit cohesion, discipline, and so forth. Ukraine has all these factors, and Russia does not. And that really proved dominant. Russia has, for a long time, assumed to have a superiority in numbers. So numbers of tanks, numbers of aircraft, and so forth. So a quantitative advantage. But increasingly, because of Russian losses, because of Russian abandoned equipment, and because of Western support, the Ukrainians have brought that quantitative balance or quantitative calculation much closer to an even balance. And therefore, in phase two, in this current fight, what we really see is very much a very prolonged, attrition-based conflict that doesn't see large swaths of territory changing hands. It's approaching, I believe, what we might refer to as a stalemate in the Donbas. Now, this is not a peaceful stalemate. This is a bloody, brutal fight that continues in the Donbas, largely driven by bombardments on both sides, and both sides are suffering significant casualties. But neither side is gaining significant territory. So it's approaching the point where we're grinding into a situation that looks much more like the Western Front of World War I than any sort of mobile maneuver-based warfare. Where is this heading? I think for the time being, what you see is what we get. I think that this stalemate, this grinding stalemate in the Donbas region will continue for some time until one or the other side is exhausted. And I don't see that. I don't see that as a near-term event. Now, I think both sides believe that they still have the potential to gain on the ground, and therefore there's not meaningful openings right now for a negotiated settlement. I believe eventually, if we think about where this is headed, I think eventually we will end this by way of a negotiation between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But that's not yet in sight. We should buckle up for, I think, months of what we see right now, which is this sort of grinding stalemate. And at the end of the day, this is fundamentally on the ground a contest of logistics. So can the Russian logistics continue to support the Russian troops in Ukraine? And can our tactical logistics support the Ukrainians? So it's a fight for logistics. And this is weapon systems, ammunition, and so forth, right? And on a broader, more strategic front, this is a contest between Putin's ability to sustain the fight, given the biting sanctions that have been in place on the Russian economy, versus on our side, the cohesion of the Western coalition that supports the sanctions regime and continues to supply military support to the Ukrainians. So it's a contest of logistics, if you will, both at the tactical level, so numbers of artillery pieces, numbers of artillery rounds, and so forth, but it's also more broadly a contest of strategic staying power between Putin and the Western coalition. So let me stop there by way of an attempt to open our conversation and frame the dialogue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. And again, I'm just reminding people to put their questions in the chat or the Q&A function. But let's start talking about the economic impacts of the war, which have obviously been very broad, and have had global implications. The first is obviously the impact on energy. We've already seen spikes in US gas prices, and I know that the impacts in Europe and elsewhere are much more profound. What do you see as the kind of more medium term impacts on the global oil market, and how is the market going to adjust?
Well, first of all, the key word there is global, right? This is a global marketplace. And while Russia is a major global supplier, it's not the only supplier. And as the system adapts, as the system accounts for European steps and American steps to cut off Russian energy resources, the marketplace will adapt, right? And these resources will go elsewhere. It's important to recognize that the sanctions regime, so both the US, our NATO allies, and many Asian allies, so Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so forth, that coalition represents about 60% of global GDP, right? So 60% of the global marketplace, if you will, right? However, it only represents, the same coalition only represents less than 20% of global population. So there's a lot of global population represented in nation states that are not part of the coalition, but are still willing to buy Russian oil and gas, right? And these fence sitters, if you will, most prominently China, obviously, but also India, Brazil, much of the global South, right, are taking somewhat advantage of now the Russians' gas and oil, which will be eventually cut off from Europe, right? And will seek other markets. So to some extent, this is an opportunity for them to buy some cheap oil and gas. But the disruptions, the disruptive effect of Europe, for example, which is about 20% of global GDP all by itself, of Europe making the strategic decision that by the end of this year, it will cut off 90% of Russian oil. That alone, in an already tight market at high prices, will continue to disrupt and be a disruption on the global energy market. The market can't adapt that quickly. And so we're going to be in a period, I think, of sustained energy prices along the lines of what we see now, perhaps even higher. And when Europe takes on the next big objective, which is the import of Russian natural gas, which the European Union has not yet ruled on natural gas. It has taken a step with regard to Russian oil. That will have another reverberating impact on the global energy markets. So I'm afraid not much relief in place.
Yeah.
Now, over the longer term, so, and please don't ask me to define the longer term, years from now, right? I think you'll see increasing markets for LNG because LNG terminals are already beginning to pop up on the periphery, on the coastlines of Europe, as Europe begins to imagine life without the pipeline gas from Russia, and so the U.S. LNG suppliers, I think, will be in good position down the road. States, major LNG exporters like Qatar, for example, or the UAE and the Persian Gulf, will be in good shape. But of course, that switch is not made overnight, right? I mean, that's a lot of infrastructure that's got to be built, and the terminals and so forth. So in the near term, I'm afraid Americans will feel the pinch of this global disruption, even though we're not ourselves importing nearly any Russian oil.
Thank you. So of course, the other major economic impact is on food, global food security. ALI is actually having a standalone program on food security in July, but this is an important part of this discussion. Obviously, we see this having impacts in countries like in the Middle East that buy a significant amount of their grain from Russia and Ukraine. Again, how do you see this playing out over the?
Well, again, it's somewhat analogous to the energy situation because this is a global marketplace, right? So you have not only Ukraine and Russia itself as major exporters of grain, so think wheat, right? But also things like sunflower oil, so cooking oils and so forth, and with an indirect effect, fertilizer, agricultural fertilizer, all of which will impact the food security situation in the Middle East, where these commodities are not grown, and through large swaths of Africa. So I think that one of the downstream effects of the war in Ukraine, because of the blockage, the interruption of these food supplies, will be to place in danger large populations of the world, especially in the Middle East and Africa, which are already somewhat unstable politically. And I think food insecurity could further the political instability of these regions. And this will be something we're going to want to watch.
Yeah. How is the Russian economy holding up? Are the sanctions actually having the intended effect? Are there unintended consequences?
I think the most direct effect, well, the most immediate effect was a devaluation of the Russian currency, the ruble. But the ruble has regained much of its purchasing power, which is kind of proven more
interesting.
It's proven more resilient than I think many analysts suspected, right? I think the most immediate impact is that some 400 Western firms have packed up and left. I mean, you've probably seen the reports of Starbucks and McDonald's, right? Those are interesting, but British Petroleum, Shell, Ford, GM are all divesting. And those kinds of big corporate decisions, commercial decisions, I think suggest that the impact is going to be downstream impact will be severe on Russia, because as these firms depart, the sanctions, which will pinch the import of technologies and so forth, will actually be more biting than if these firms were in place themselves. So I think downstream, the sanctions are going to have a very significant effect on Russia, but it will take time. This is, the history of economic sanctions is that you have to be very patient, and we're talking years sometimes for them to feel full effect. Yeah. One other sector that I would mention, though, that hasn't gotten much attention yet are critical minerals, right? So Russia is a major supplier of high grade aluminum, nickel, palladium, and so forth. Some of these niche minerals that are used in particular for the green economy, to power the green, to enable the green economy. And it's interesting because we have not sanctioned them yet. And I think that one of the, the sort of behind the scenes assessment here is that we're so critically reliant on some of these critical minerals for our own national objectives.
Right.
So moving towards the green economy, for example, nickel is probably the iconic example as a key component of batteries, right? And electronic vehicles, or electric vehicles, and so forth. Nobody's talking yet about moving towards sanctioning these critical minerals. But when you add this together, whether it's energy or food or critical minerals, what it really shows is that we have, over the last, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, we have so globalized the economy and become so interdependent, which I know is one of the themes of ALI, right? That it's when you decide, because of an event like the Russian invasion, to try to disconnect a supplier from this interwoven network of the marketplace, it proves very hard. It's not easy to unwind 30 years of economic connections, but that's what we're in the business of doing. So Putin's 100 days into his war. We're 100 days into unwinding 3 decades of economic connections with Russia.
Yeah. I think to your point earlier, however, you've got large suppliers like China, that are really willing to step in and fill some of the sanctions gaps.
Well, so far we have not seen. We've seen the rhetoric in China, right, align mostly with Russia, right? So they're not. When I mentioned fence sitters earlier, I wouldn't count China as a fence sitter. They're on Russia's side of the fence in terms of the rhetoric, right? But they have not. They've been careful so far not to try to defeat the sanctions or end run the sanctions by way of supplying. So, most of the analysis I read suggests that that's because President Xi in China is concerned that if he were to step in and mitigate the effects of the Western sanctions regime, that he could be vulnerable to indirect sanctions himself. And of course, the Chinese economy is not in a position where he wants to try to absorb that. The fact that 60% of global GDP is aligned here against Russia has got to have gotten the attention, must have gotten the attention of President Xi in China.
Yeah. So I have a number of other questions, but there's a question in the chat that I'm going to turn to right now. And this question is there any evidence of the Russians continuing their propaganda disinformation campaign to introduce doubt and split up democracies?
Absolutely. This is what Putin is counting on. Right. This is his strategic game plan, right? He made the assumption that we would not be as united as we have been. I think that took him by surprise. He didn't expect 60% of the world GDP to align against him economically and to impose these sanctions. So he was taken aback. But he's also seen the history of the West over time and what typically happens. For example, what happened after his last invasion of Ukraine in 2014 is that, the West has sort of a modest initial response, but then we begin to lose attention. Other policy issues crop up. Our attention is diverted, and eventually, Western coalitions typically suffer from divisions or fissures because of domestic political impact. So here in the States, for example, he's probably watching closely the run-up to the midterm elections in November, and he'll be looking for political fissures that he might take advantage of. It'll be interesting as the European Union designed the package against Russian oil. Hungary, for example, would not move into consensus with the other 27 members of the European Union And therefore, they had to carve out an exception for Hungary. Of course, Hungary is President Orban, and Hungary is closely aligned with President Putin. And that's obviously an interesting opportunity for Putin, right? Because he could not get consensus on EU consensus. When the EU takes up the next question, the next big tranche, which will be natural gas, Putin will look for others, fissures and fractures. So he's betting that our staying power will be less than his staying power. And we'll have to prove him wrong.
So somebody else is asking, given Putin's past behaviors, such as meddling in Georgia, Crimea, et cetera, did we have an intelligence failure to anticipate this event and really plan for it?
Well, this one was hard to miss, because unlike 2014, when he seized Crimea, and then also in 2014, he supported Russian-speaking Ukrainian separatists in the same Donbass region where the fighting's taking place now, right? He did that rather subtly. He did not mass troops. He did a lot with misinformation and disinformation and so forth. And he used Ukrainian proxies rather than Russian troops themselves, by and large, right? This time, however, he amassed over 150,000 Russian combat troops in Russia for months before crossing the border into Ukraine. So that was hard to miss. And I think we didn't miss that. In fact, we advertised it, and we disclosed his plans, I think, in a very helpful way, right? What we did miss, however, was this mismatch in quality between the quality of the Russian forces, which has proven very lacking, and the unexpected high quality and cohesion of the Ukrainian forces. So we did a good job counting things. We did not do as well assessing the sort of intangible factors of the upcoming fight. So I think a lot of intelligence analysts were surprised that the Russian military performed as poorly as it did. So we got some of it right and some not so right.
So one other big fallout from the conflict has been huge number of refugees. I think more than 2 million have fled Ukraine now. And I've heard the UN High Commission on Refugees is predicting that will go to 4 million fairly soon. And it's the largest mass migration in Europe since World War II. What, again, is going to be the impact of that? And especially for many of the states that are absorbing the refugees.
Right. Well, my count is we're already over 4 or 5 million refugees, and probably double that number displaced, but still remaining inside Ukraine, right? And so against a population of 40 million, you're approaching something like a half of them have been moved into either displaced persons or refugee status, which is just a tremendous number. Most of those who have sought refugee status have obviously moved west. And as they move west, they move into 4 Central European states. So Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And those are 4 NATO allies. So one of the things that Putin may be counting on here is that this massive flow of refugees will disrupt the political setting, the domestic political setting in these democracies, right? In these, and I use democracies with quotes because there's at least, if there are 4 different states there are 4 different versions of democracy, right? But he's hopeful that this refugee flow will be a factor in opening opportunities for him and creating political divisions and domestic political pressures against those states, which are so far still supporting, all 4 of them are NATO allies, and all 4 of them so far have been reasonably supportive, with a bit of a footnote there with regard to Hungary, which has been less so. So the refugee flow is not only a humanitarian crisis, right? And as you said, a humanitarian crisis of the magnitude that we haven't seen in decades. But it's also a political factor. And I think Putin will be watching this very closely. So he's going to watch oil. He's going to watch gas. He's going to watch critical minerals. He's going to watch the food situation. He's going to watch the refugee flow, all of which might present him opportunities.
Do you think this is something that could also be a little destabilizing for Europe? Because obviously those countries are really going to want additional financial support, I would think,
Sure.
from the EU to support all refugees. And there's already a lot of, I'll say, refugee fatigue in Europe.
Right. Well, so far, it's interesting. The last major inflow of refugees into Europe came from largely the war in Syria, right? And the aftermath of that. And this example of European welcoming of Ukrainian refugees is different. The reports are very encouraging that the Polish population in particular, but beyond Poland, further west, the German population and so forth, have been very welcoming. The European Union has been generous with regard to its support, largely to UN and non-governmental organizations that try to relieve some of the refugee crisis. So far, so good. But as this war goes on, and as the Ukrainian economy continues to suffer, by the way, the Ukrainian economy has contracted by about 50%. So the Ukrainian ability to support the Ukrainians who have not yet left, so they're not yet refugees, but they're displaced, it will be another opportunity for Putin downstream. And it really reminds us that while the American supply of artillery and ammunition and drones and anti-tank weapons and all that is very important for the military effort, an equally important part of Western support to Ukraine is the humanitarian support, and both internal to Ukraine, but also to those neighboring states who are now housing refugees.
So, we talked about a little bit about China earlier. They're obviously also looking at the situation in Ukraine and Russia's invasion with a thought regarding their situation with Taiwan. And I think on the one hand, it may cause them to pause. But on the other hand, I could see them being a little emboldened, thinking that they could do a much better job than the Russians are doing.
Well, militarily, these are two dramatically different sets, right? I mean, if you consider Russia invading Ukraine or China trying to control Taiwan, much different. But there are some military analogies here that are useful. And I think there have been some reports that the Taiwanese are watching carefully the Ukrainian success stories with regard to pushing back against a strong neighbor, and the types of weapon systems, the way they're organized, and so forth, that could be quite helpful to the defense of Taiwan. I can't help but to imagine that President Xi is looking at this situation and wondering if a move by China to attack and control Taiwan wouldn't spark the same kind of or a similar international response to what Putin is now contending with. And if you were to pose to President Xi this notion that 60% of the world's GDP that China would be cut off from 60% of the world's GDP and suffer the kind of sanctions that have now been proven, have been imposed, demonstrated against Russia, I think that's got to have a deterrent effect. And maybe I'm looking for the silver lining here in a catastrophe, the war in Ukraine. But if there's one potentially very positive thing that could come of this, it would be that the war in Ukraine serves as a warning shot to President Xi in terms of what potentially he could suffer if he were to try to take over Taiwan.
Yeah, I do think it would be much, much harder to impose those kind of sanctions on China.
Well, again, if the theme here is that we're, in effect, these sanctions represent an attempt to unravel economic connections, right? Your point is right? It's much easier to disconnect from Russia, minus energy and food, the items we've talked about, right? Than it is the vastly greater economic interdependence with China.
Right.
I accept your point, but the challenge here is that while we would suffer by imposing those sanctions, she would have to account for its impact on China as well. So it wouldn't be easy for us to do, but it would be catastrophic for him in terms of his economy and where he wants to take the Chinese economy. So again, maybe I'm just the eternal optimist, but I'm hopeful that he sees the problems here and will be warned.
Good. Well, I'm gonna go with your optimism.
It's just better.
It's better than the alternative, for sure. So the OECD just released its economic outlook and has some recommendations on what global policymakers should do. I'm going to read these and just kind of get your thoughts. More aid and global cooperation to avert a food crisis. Signals from central banks that they won't allow inflation to spread. Tighten US monetary policy. More solidarity in Europe on defense and energy spending, and keep trade open as much as possible to ensure diverse supply chains and kind of still go with, encourage a green transition. Are there other things that you would add to kind of what the world should be doing to manage sort of the food crisis, the global crisis, the war, the refugee crisis?
Well, I think that one thing we should be doing is reminding ourselves, or perhaps reinvesting in some of the global institutions that have served us well over the last decades, right? So I'm closest to NATO as a former US ambassador there, and then before that as an Army officer, having served in NATO. And it's easy over the decades to lose sight of the sort of the value, the enduring value of institutions like NATO. But investing in NATO and investing in the cohesion of the alliance is very important. And it speaks directly to one of the OECD recommendations, which is sustain the military support for Ukrainians, right? Give the Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves. But nobody has been better for NATO cohesion and NATO solidarity than Vladimir Putin, right?
Absolutely. It was an unintended consequence.
Right. No, he was counting on the reverse, right? He was counting on, on the ability to divide the alliance. And I have to give the Biden administration high marks. They have done a good job of cementing the alliance. And we'll see more of this, by the way, in just a couple of weeks when the NATO summit meets in Madrid, Spain. And I think it's 27, 28 June or something like that. Another institution that's worth paying attention to is the European Union, right? So something like 20% of global GDP, but obviously in the connections between the world and Russia in the wake of the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? Those connections are most strong and most important in Europe itself, because just by way of geographic proximity, right? So the EU's ability to stick together during this unraveling, this disconnecting with Russia. We've already talked about the EU decision to end, or at least to bring 90% of oil imports to an end by the end of this year, right? I'll be watching closely as a signal, as a signpost, the EU's next big project, which will be to do likewise with Russian natural gas, which will be harder to do. So we're going to watch this carefully, and in particular, I think the most important signpost there will be Germany. And Germany's obviously the largest, most populous country in Europe, the largest economy in Europe, and still something like 30% dependent on Russian natural gas. So, dependence on Russian natural gas via pipelines is not so critical in June, July, and August, but it becomes much more critical in November, December, January. So what happens there? And I think investing in the EU and supporting the EU is another important thing we should be doing. And then one that bothers me, frankly, and I'm actually sitting in our apartment here in New York, and I can look out this window and see the UN, right? And my wife has had a 20 or 30 year association with the UN in different capacities, right? But I wonder about the UN. I mean, here you have a member of the Security Council, in fact, a permanent member of the Security Council, one of 5, right, who just violated in the most fundamental possible way the UN Charter. So what is the role of the UN going forward? And can it remain a weight-bearing, a burden-bearing institution when it suffers such an assault on its principles as this Russian invasion is? So I think the long answer actually to your short question would be, I would invest in these multilateral institutions and expect them to bear weight, expect them to carry some of the burden, but support them in doing so.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting and timely discussion. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Special thanks to Ambassador Lute for taking the time to chat with us. If you're not part of the ALI community, I encourage you to check us out at www.american-leadership.org. And thank you all. We're going to obviously stay tuned and see how this evolves. But thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thanks very much.
And for your support. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.